Hi everyone, I'm Jamal. I'm a Counterfire member, and I'm talking to Chris Nineham, who is the Vice Chair of the Stop the War Coalition. And Chris, alongside Ben Jamal of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, is on trial this coming Monday, the 23rd of February, and they are being charged with breaches of the Public Order Act associated with the Palestine demo last year that happened on the 18th of January. So to start with, Chris, could you just outline what happened on the day of that demo and what you've subsequently been charged with?
So, on the demonstration, I was, as you say, arrested towards the end of the day. Benjamin was charged the following day. We were charged with breaches of the Public Order Act. I can't go into a huge amount of detail about the demonstration because we have the trial starting next week. But I mean, for me, the standout thing about it, apart from a really unusually heavy policing style on the day, was that in the run up to the protest, we had been point blank refused permission to march anywhere near the BBC. And it ended up in a situation through a kind of complicated process of negotiation and counter negotiation that we had to just have a static protest. So we weren't allowed to march at all. Now, this is really completely unprecedented to my knowledge, and I've been involved in lots of demonstrations, including organising lots of demonstrations for many years, and it's never happened that the police have just said, you can't go to the BBC, you can't go to Downing Street, you can't go to Trafalgar Square or Whitehall or whatever it might be, without there being some sort of, very practical reason. This is a decision that was made for sort of broad social or political reasons. And in that sense, it was something new, something really quite sinister and quite kind of alarming in terms of the history of protest organisation and the right to assembly in this country.
Mm. Yeah. And I think to a lot of people, this Labour government is increasingly being seen as quite authoritarian and restricting the liberties that we take for granted. So
Mm.
what does your arrest say about the state of civil liberties in this country, do you think?
Well, I mean, it is quite extraordinary that myself and Ben, and actually 70 plus others, were arrested on the day, that we all were arrested simply for being part of or organising a peaceful protest against a genocide, against the systematic murder of, thousands and thousands of people in Gaza. It's an extraordinary situation, and it kind of symbolises, I think, how bad the situation has got with civil liberties at the moment. I mean, I do think this is the most authoritarian government in living memory. And I think that there has been a kind of process over the last few decades, really, going back to the 1980s to Thatcher, but accelerating in the last 5 or 10 years, whereby new legislation has been brought in to make protesting more and more difficult. The police have been more and more antagonistic, putting more and more obstacles in our way to organising protests and demonstrations, and of course, arresting people much more readily for peaceful protest. And so, yeah, I think it is. I think it's genuinely a moment of danger, actually, in our society. I think we're moving towards a situation, and as lots of people will know, there's new legislation being put to Parliament right now to make it even harder to organise protest. We're moving towards a situation where you can only protest if you get permission from the state. And it seems that reminds me of the situation in kind of semi-democratic countries or even authoritarian dictatorships around the world, where you're allowed to protest, but only where we say, only when we say, over potentially what issues we say. Now, it seems to me if that's the road we're going down, we're going to a very dangerous place.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and the Palestine protests themselves over the last 2.5 years or so have faced really extensive restrictions. And alongside that, we've seen, Palestine Action has been prescribed as a terrorist organization. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been arrested for holding placards. And obviously, the government has just failed in its attempts to prosecute the Filton 24. Why do you think the Palestine movement has become the main target of this government's authoritarianism?
Well, I think the issue of Palestine kind of crystallizes out the problems that are faced in a way that the government faces, because on the one hand, you have a situation where public opinion has turned against the what Israel is doing. People feel very, very angry and worried about the fact that it's happening at all. They want to do something to stop it. Many people want to do something to stop it. People are very concerned about the fact that the British government has actually been supporting Israel throughout this whole abysmal process, including selling the weapons, as everyone knows. And so there's a real anger in society about it, which perhaps is a bit unexpected from the point of view of the government, but nevertheless is very, very real. So you have that on the one hand. On the other hand, you have a situation where the British establishment, in its wisdom, still feels that supporting Israel, partly because of the special relationship with the US, partly because of its historic ties to Israel, still feels as if that's non-negotiable. They're still going to continue with this policy. And Wes Streeting's Wes Streeting's WhatsApp messages to Peter Mandelson that he himself publicised show that even he, a right-wing, pro-Starmer, individual, recognised that what is happening in what Israel is doing is war crimes, that is absolutely appalling. But so that kind of underlines the fact that everyone knows what's happening, even the establishment knows what's happening, but they're prepared to pay the human price in order to continue their policy of supporting Israel, because they want to control the Middle East. They see Israel as being very, very important in terms of their Western control over the oil in the Middle East and the gas and so on and so forth. So that is the background to the situation. And it leads to this appalling state of affairs where they turn reality on its head. They say peace marches are hate marches. They say, direct action activists are terrorists. They say that musicians are stirring up, disorder, and so they clamp down. That's really their only option. They've lost the argument. Their early attempts to sort of demonise the movement have failed, so they're left now with just a policy of clamping down. And I think that's really the basis of where we are. And it's true it's about Palestine, but this whole process could be replicated over a whole number of different issues, and was actually replicated over the climate campaigns a few years ago. It will, as discontent in society grows, it will be used. These kind of powers will be used more and more against all sorts of different people. So it's a very serious situation.
Yeah, and like you say, there's discontent has been growing over the last few years. We're in quite an unprecedented situation where the two-party system, which is held for a few decades, has now kind of disintegrated, and many of the mainstream parties are facing a legitimacy crisis, and the far right, meanwhile, is on the rise both electorally and on the streets. So what do you think your case and this whole situation with the Palestine movement, how do you think that ties into this political environment that we're in?
Well, I think we are going through a period of really a quite deep crisis for the ruling class, in terms of the way in which people perceive, people talk about the Westminster bubble, politicians being completely corrupt. The elites are, doing terrible things behind closed doors, by the way, including just feathering their own nests. They're concerned simply about their own well-being. They have no real plan for how to take society forward. In fact, they've been attacking, ever since Thatcher, really, they've been attacking working class living standards. They've been attacking the welfare state. They've been taking away what security ordinary people do have in society. And that's led them to a situation where they are very, very isolated. And I think in those circumstances, the temptation to move towards more authoritarian methods is quite real for them, because I think they feel quite insecure because they have generated such a huge amount of bitterness and anger and resentment against them, and to some extent they're aware of that, and so that's why they're reaching for these more draconian ways of ruling, and I think that it's also worth saying that this kind of has its own dynamic. It was the Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci who said that the moment that an elite or a ruling class starts to try and move from more or less consensual rule to rule more or less by coercion is a very dangerous moment for the wider population, but it's also a dangerous moment for the elites themselves, because people are used to having some sort of, due process. They're used to certain levels of freedom, however limited they may have been, over things like freedom of speech and civil liberties and the right to protest. And to see those being taken away in the most brutal way, and to see, by the way, a kind of foreign policy that is, in lockstep with that, is like a kind of naked gunboat imperialism, which is what Trump is pushing towards, and by the way, what the European and the British government are going along with. To see all this is quite an eye-opener for people, and it's quite disturbing for people. And I think there can be a very, very big pushback against it. So it is a very alarming situation, but it's also a moment when I think opposition can make some headway. And I think actually what we saw in Minneapolis and to some extent in other cities around the United States in the last few weeks has shown that, in a way that was overreach from the point of view of Donald Trump and the authorities in the US. There was a big campaign against ICE and the brutality of ICE that was very well organised and went deep, deep into society. And that kind of seems to have galvanised a really big movement across the United States against them. So I think that what's happening in the States right now is an illustration of the fact that it is possible to organise opposition. It is possible to push back against these kinds of attacks on civil liberties. I also think it's an illustration of the fact that if you don't, you're in big, big trouble.
Mm. Yeah, and like you say, do you think the establishment's attempts here to quell this discontent using more authoritarian methods is a risk for them? Does it risk creating a cycle where they just breed more discontent?
I think that's right. And then, of course, that then leads to more authoritarianism. So I think there's that dynamic built into the situation. And the outcome of it is not predetermined. I think it can lead to a situation where more and more, and obviously it is leading to a situation in which more and more sections of the different ruling classes around the world are reaching towards kind of far right options as a way of trying to secure their position and quell dissent and so on and so forth. And that's a real risk in this situation, no question about it. And it's a risk we have to take very, very seriously. And what will decide this the kind of future, the way this unravels, will be how well organised we are and whether or not we're prepared to stand up against the encroaching authoritarian tendencies. And that's the crucial question, the kind of subjective factor, whether people just shrug their shoulders and say, oh, well, it's pretty bad, but what can you do? Or whether people get organised and do what they did in Minneapolis, get organisation in every community, in every workplace, bring together an alliance of people that unites all the different working class communities and the churches and the trade unions and actually sort of bring together an alliance that is really prepared to stand up. That's the big question here. The question, really is about what we do now. And I think it's important when we're considering that to recognise this point that I'm trying to make, that these more and more draconian measures are, in a certain sense, a product of weakness. They're a product of the fact that even these elites understand that they are draining legitimacy, that even they understand that, they've got a problem justifying what they're doing. And I think we need to recognise that. And I think if we do take a stand, and if we're courageous, we're dynamic, we're well organised, we're not fighting amongst ourselves, but we're organising broad but militant kind of alliances. If we do that, I think we can push back against these attacks very effectively. But, it's not given in advance.
Mm. And do you think there's a strange lesson almost in a way that because the anti-war movement through Stop the War, through its links that were built with the Muslim community over the Iraq War, because it was so organized and because it was able to mobilize, people on such a large scale in some of the biggest demonstrations that happen globally, do you think that's almost why it's been targeted, because it's been so effective in some ways?
I think there is truth in that. I mean, I think there's no doubt that the kind of anti-war, pro-Palestine, anti-imperialist side of popular organisation in this country has drawn the most fire from the establishment in general. If you think about the whole arguments about the allegations, the spurious allegations of anti-Semitism, those have been targeted against, they targeted Corbyn, who was always had a very strong anti-war part of his politics. They've then gone on to be used against people who are pro-Palestine and against the anti-war movement more generally. So, I think, these issues are very, very important for the British ruling class, partly because of its history of running the biggest empire in the world, and the legacy of that, which is that Britain has more foreign direct investment, has more interests abroad than certainly any other European country, and arguably per capita than any other country in the world. And so this whole global Britain thing is absolutely crucial to the British ruling class. It's not some sort of, foreign policy isn't some sort of add-on. It's not some sort of optional extra. It goes right to the heart of the existence of the British ruling class, which is also something that can be, that is illustrated by the fact that finance is so important. London is the centre of finance. And that's crucial to the ruling class. And that, again, is a product, ultimately, of historical empire. So I think, these issues about imperialism, about support for Israel, about foreign wars, they are absolutely critical issues. And they're things, they're not just going to roll over on because they're so important to them. And that's why the struggle is so harsh. And that's why they're so, they're so prepared to go to really take big risks by being so draconian about them, and by continuing their support for Israel when everyone knows what Israel is doing. But these things are very, very central to the British establishment. So we've got to keep on the struggle. There's another Palestine demonstration coming up on May the 16th, which has to be really big. There's the March the 28th demonstration against the far right. That has to be really strong as well. But if we can turn them into mass mobilizations, then we can also turn the tide, in my opinion.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And then lastly, you're on trial with Ben Jamal next week, and how can people support you while you're on trial?
Well, we've had a huge amount of support, and it's very sort of encouraging. But this is really about supporting the movement. This is really about winning an argument in society about the right to protest and about the importance of the Palestine question. But we do have a protest on Monday, on the first day of our trial, at Westminster Magistrates Court, which is Monday, February the 23rd, 9 a.m. If people can make it along to that, that would be fantastic, and it would send a message to the establishment, to the courts, to the political people standing behind the police and so forth that we're not going to put up with this. So that's a great first step.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thanks for having me.